Hello and welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Richards. In this last Hot Topic before the European parliamentary elections, I'm joined by Rebecca Taylor, sitting member of the Parliament for Yorkshire and the Humber, representing the Liberal Democrats. Rebecca, welcome. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.
First of all, we must establish you came into the European Parliament as a result of one of your predecessors' resignations.
Indeed, in 2012.
And that was by, you were next on the list from the previous elections, and so you automatically went.
Exactly, I was a candidate in 2009.
But you're not standing again in this election.
I'm not standing this time, no.
But you are nevertheless a supporter of the Liberal Democratic cause.
Oh, absolutely.
In Europe and in the UK.
Absolutely, yes.
I just want to talk about the brute politics of this election
Sure.
just for a moment. The Liberal Democrats are great proponents of proportional representation.
Indeed.
Which is the system by which, by region, members of the European Parliament are elected, and it is the system that favours small parties. It's going to be UKIP especially, perhaps the Greens and other small parties as well, that are going to be taking that favour from the electoral system rather than the Liberal Democrats this time round, isn't it?
Well, we don't support the system because it favours us, we support it because we think it's fairer. So, and actually the type of PR that we would propose would be single transferable vote, not the closed list system that's used here. It's a slightly different system.
But is that not, whether or not it's fair or not, it's still going to be damaging to, I mean, you are, as one of the small parties, not the smallest by any means, but you are going to be losing that small party advantage because it's going to be split by UKIP and the Greens especially. It's going to be a very rough election for the Lib Dems, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a difficult election for anyone who's in government right now. I don't think the Tories would say that they're having an easy European Parliament campaign. But I think we've got the right messages. The question is, can we get them to the voters? And I think we've been trying, so we'll see.
But your message, well, we'll go into the messages in a moment. Yeah. We much prefer to be talking about that. But a lot of the voters aren't interested in the message so much. They're not interested in an ideology. They're interested in a particular relationship with Europe as they vote for a European institution.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that UKIP especially is gaining such support, that there is currently anyway such an anti-European feeling?
Well, yes and no, because interestingly enough, since UKIP have been getting more attention, the regular polling that's done on voters saying, would you vote to stay or leave in the European Union, the ins have overtaken the outs about 6 months ago, and that trend hasn't changed. So it's interesting that that happens at the same time. And actually, I read a poll a couple of weeks ago that said that 57% of UKIP members would like to live in another European country, which is quite ironic considering they're voting for a party that would like to strip them of the right to do that. So I think quite a lot of the UKIP vote isn't none of the above vote. It's we don't like the rest, so we'll vote UKIP. And I've seen people even say that, writing on sort of newspaper, comments saying, well, I don't really like UKIP, but I don't like the others, and this is my way of saying that I don't like the others.
Is that not an awfully irresponsible way to operate one's vote? To vote for something that you detest,
everyone's got the right to use their vote as they wish.
Do they have the right to be respected for using their vote in that way?
I would rather people vote for something than against it. But this is a democracy, and people can choose to vote how they wish. I might not agree with who they're voting for, but obviously that's their right to do so.
I wasn't suggesting disenfranchising
anybody. Yes, okay.
But I do think there's a judgment that can be made. The Liberal Democrats have been sloganeering in this campaign under the line, the party of in.
In Europe, in work.
Specifically
yes.
in Europe.
In Europe, in work.
Well, everybody wants to be in work. That's not that's not controversial.
Yes.
Being in Europe is
well, the two are linked. That's the point.
Well, the Liberal Democrats are the only main party that does want to be in Europe. The Labour Party suggests that it might or might not have a referendum.
Well, the Labour Party is rather silent on this issue. I'm not really sure.
The Labour Party
is rather silent on this issue.
Yes. Well, I think their view is if in the future, after the next election, there's a big change to the institutions, then we'll have a referendum. But you're right,
yeah, they've kind of
vague.
Copied the Liberal Democrat policy on that we had already.
The Conservatives have a point of view that there'll be a referendum, whatever happens, however, if they were to be returned to power with a majority, whatever their renegotiation. The UKIP policy is obvious, but the Liberal Democrat is very much promoting the idea of being in Europe. But it's the only one of the major parties that is.
Indeed, yes. I don't know what's... The Labour Party traditionally is not particularly anti-European, at least not in recent decades. So I'm not sure what's happened to their pro-European views. Some of them are still being expressed. But we're not just the party of in. Being in doesn't mean we don't criticise anything the European Union does, or we think nothing should change. In fact, we believe we are pro-Europe, we are pro-reform. We've actually led on a number of areas of reform, and the common fisheries policy is one of them. There's been historic changes last year that will be extremely beneficial to the fishing industry in the UK, for example.
If I can just go into the institutional reforms, so the idea of Europe as an idea rather than as an operator of its policies.
Sure.
There's the possibility of further reform, as there was in the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, that the European institutions become more democratic, more answerable to the people they govern, and thus gain more democratic authority and legitimacy at the expense of national governments. Now, what would be the Liberal Democratic point of view if there were a reform that meant that the executive and legislative roles of the European Union were more legitimate democratically than the national governments?
Well, I'm not sure that by making the European institutions more democratic, you automatically say that the national governments are less legitimate. I don't think I wouldn't put it in a give and take like that.
I know you don't. It would be a different proportional representation under a liberal democratic ideal for the European Union, but nevertheless, it does have a proportionally representative European Parliament.
Indeed, yes.
Whereas the Westminster government has what you would regard as an unfairly elected and therefore democratically less legitimate Parliament.
Indeed, it doesn't represent the votes cast and the way that the Parliament is split up at Westminster. It's not representative. I mean, we don't have a representative voting system.
Where the European Parliament is elected is more representative.
It's a PR system, yes.
So does that not, in your view, give the European Parliament a greater democratic legitimacy than the Westminster Parliament?
But you could compare then perhaps the British Parliament to the Irish Parliament, where they vote through STV, and say the same thing.
I'm only comparing the Westminster Parliament to the European Parliament because they're the two that we're looking at, that have authority over my viewers.
Well, personally, I would like to see the voting system change for Westminster, because not because I think it would be helpful to the Liberal Democrats, but because I think it would reinvigorate our democracy, because we have, of course, the iniquity of a safe seat where people say, well, what is the point of voting? Because I know that I will get a Tory or a Labour MP and my vote makes no difference. And I think it wouldn't be a bad thing to move to a system where everybody knows that their vote counts for something. Whereas there are, sadly, seats where, unfortunately, I would never say don't vote, but people, if they're not a supporter of the incumbent party, they know that their vote will make very little difference.
Well, you bring up the proportional representation thing, and I'll just bring that down to the domestic reform. The proportional representation does have its problems, one of which would be that with a system of proportional representation, there is unlikely ever to be an overall majority party in the Westminster Parliament. And without a majority party, as we are now, there's going to be a state of permanent coalition, which is a government for which nobody has voted.
Well, previously we had governments that ruled with a majority when 35% have voted for them. So, there are pros and cons on both sides.
35% is more than zero. Nobody voted for put an X by the box marked coalition. A coalition is by definition...
But by not handing a majority to a single party, they've given the message that they didn't think any single party was good enough to govern alone.
Well, they weren't giving the message that we're giving a mandate to an arrangement cooked up 3 days after a general election between two leaders.
There are a number of European countries that function regularly on coalition governments and function quite well. No, not all of them, but France has a majority government. Germany now has a coalition, has had other arrangements before. Sweden usually has coalitions.
One more thing, that also PR separates the representative from the constituency. There's
well, not if you use STV like the Irish do, no, because then you vote for an individual.
So you'd recommend that we follow the Irish example?
Well, they've been doing it since 1921, and so it's obviously not that complicated.
Well, I'm sure you're right. We'll come back. There's one other point I want to make about proportional representation, but we'll have to do that after the break. Rebecca, thank you very much. We'll have to stop there. We must stop for a second. Please rejoin us in a moment.
More proportional system, then you feel that your vote is counting for something.
Well, that's rather like saying that I'd get some prize money when I bet on a horse that comes seventh, because at least I'd feel that my horse has made the effort to go over the fence.
Not sure.
Welcome back. I'm with Rebecca Taylor, who was until recently a Liberal Democratic member of the European Parliament for Yorkshire and the Humber. Rebecca, thanks again for coming in. We were talking about proportional representation there. There's just a point I wanted to finish off about the referendum a few years ago in which The AV system, which is not the one you would advocate,
Yes.
was rejected by the electorate. Nevertheless, that referendum was held, and the condition of that referendum was that the Liberal Democrats would support boundary changes in England and Wales as the quid pro quo, as it were, in the coalition deal. And yet the Liberal Democrats, having had a referendum, have failed to support those boundary changes.
Yes, and there was also promises given that, you know, the Tory party would be supporting the referendum, and that didn't happen.
Well, they allowed the referendum to go ahead.
Yes,
Presumably they were going to say what
and
they thought of the issue.
Yes, and they were also going to support House of Lords reform, but unfortunately they reneged on that.
Whether or not it's a matter of a negotiating point, something that you're owed, or that you didn't think you got what you wanted in return with boundary change.
Well, it was with the House of Lords reform,
is it not just a better democracy anyway if the constituencies all have about the same number of people, if each MP represents about the same number of people? Would you not want that as a fundamental of a democracy anyway? Why would it be an obstacle?
Personally, I don't think that's the key problem that we have in the Westminster democracy.
No, but it is a problem, isn't it? One that would be easy to fix if the Lib Dems would simply allow it.
I mean, boundaries do get changed, they do get reviewed quite regularly, and they do get changed. There was a few in the Yorkshire region last time. There were some new seats created. York Outer, for example, didn't exist previously. So it's something that happens on a continuous basis.
Yes, but there is currently some members of Parliament represent many more people than other members of Parliament.
But that's also to do with the sort of makeup of where they live. Because obviously, if you live in a rural area, you may cover a huge amount of space but have less voters. Whereas if you live in the middle of a city, there naturally will be more people living there. So
well, that rural space should be bigger then, shouldn't it? And the city space should be smaller, because it's not a democracy if 90,000 people are represented by one person in one part of the country, and 70,000 people are represented by one person if they're from another part of the country. I mean, this is an old Chartist requirement to have equal-sized constituencies, or else our votes don't count for the same representation in Parliament, depending on where we live.
Yeah, well, that's your view.
That's a
Chartist view. I think there's a lot of reforms that are needed, and as I say,
why do you stand in the way of one? Is it just as a matter of a negotiating block for something else you want?
House of Lords reform, yes, that was the point.
So the Liberal Democratic position is that we can't have one unless we can have both.
Well, we need to reform lots of things, and that to me wasn't the number one thing that needs reforming. I personally think our voting system needs changing more than we need to change constituencies, because we have constituencies where people's votes don't count if they don't support the incumbent party, and I think if you live somewhere like that and you don't support the incumbent party, you sort of feel a bit left out when everyone else votes. Because even if you vote, it will make no difference.
Everybody in a democracy, if they're in the minority and didn't vote for the people who get into power, is going to feel a bit left out.
But at least if you have a more proportional system, then you feel that your vote is counting for something.
Well, that's rather like saying that I'd get some prize money when I bet on a horse that comes seventh, because at least I'd feel that my horse has made the effort to go over the fences.
I'm not sure I'd compare horse racing to democracy. But
no, well, perhaps you're right. A little bit more about the domestic future of the Liberal Party in Westminster. At the moment, Parliament hasn't got anything to do, because everything in the coalition government has been achieved.
Well, at the moment, pretty much everybody's busy with the election campaigns for
they're
the 22nd of May.
People are electioning, domestic politicians, members of the House of Commons, are electioneering much more now than they usually do during local or European parliamentary elections.
Well, we have two lots of elections the same day as well.
But they have nothing to do. There is no programme. The Queen's speech has been bumped back a couple of times because there's no agenda to put before the House. Because everything that was in the agreement, the coalition agreement, has been either done or failed to be done.
That doesn't prevent other things being done.
No, but everybody your colleagues in another parliament in Westminster will tell you they're very idle at the moment. Is it maybe not time that there should be another general election, simply because the Liberal Democratic and Conservative coalition has done everything it wanted to?
Well, one of the things we did was establish a fixed-term parliament, so if we were to change that, we'd be going back on something we already did. Most countries have fixed-term parliaments. We were one of the few that didn't. I mean, obviously there are circumstances under which you would have an election before the end of a fixed term, but we haven't arrived at any of those circumstances.
So what would you suggest British Westminster parliamentarians do until next May?
Oh, I'm sure there's still plenty of things to do. I know colleagues were in the House today talking about the Pfizer-AstraZeneca possible buyout. So I think some of them are being kept quite busy with other things. And of course, MPs don't just sit in the House. I mean, they do also sort things out for their constituents.
How are
the local issues to deal with?
How are your colleagues in the cabinet getting on with their Conservative friends? There's a suggestion that Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, thinks that Michael Gove, the Conservative Secretary of State for Education, is a bit of a fanatic.
Well, they certainly don't have the same views on quite a few issues. And I know there's been some discussion, could I say argument, this week concerning where funding is coming from for different policies. Obviously, free schools being a Tory policy and free school meals for children being a Liberal Democrat policy. And when we announced the free school meals policy, I had understood that the funding for this was already established. Now, apparently some Tories, I think Mr Gove himself, have been saying that no, the money's coming from somewhere else. And I mean, I'm not involved obviously because I'm not actually in the Westminster Parliament, but then maybe the question is where would you prefer the money to go to free schools or to free school meals? I think I know where my choice would be.
If the present coalition is not possible after a general election, next May.
This is for the voters to decide.
Of course it's for the voters to decide.
So.
But if it's not possible for that coalition to continue, either because neither party, well, possibly, presumably because if there's another hung parliament, the Liberal Democrats might be willing to go into coalition with the Labour Party. Would that work? Would that be possible?
Who knows? I think never say never. We're a party that believes generally in cooperation and working with others. That's how it works in the European Parliament where I sit, because of the political makeup of Europe, there will never be a political party or group, in the case of the European Parliament, that has a majority. So you have to work with others to get things through. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
It's an interesting point, though, that the sort of ideological spectrum of the British parties, I'm sorry to keep going back to the House of Commons, we'll go back to Europe in a moment, but that in many ways, in many policies, the Liberal Party is more left-wing, more statist, more egalitarian, more redistributive than the Labour Party, or certainly than the last Labour governments. Now, if it were that
this point has been made before.
Well, it used to always be the great sort of centre party, but perhaps the centre has moved far to the right now of the Liberal Party. Now, if the Liberal and the Labour Party were to go into coalition, that would rather sort of shift the ground back to the left in British politics, wouldn't it?
I think really the ground that everyone is seeking to occupy in British politics is in fact the centre ground, because that's, I think, where you find the bulk of the voters. People in the UK, I think, don't like extremes of either side.
That's a very Liberal Democratic thing to say, that everybody's seeking the centre ground because that's where the voters are.
Yeah.
Is that the job of a politician, to be harvesting voters, or is it the job of a politician to be trying to persuade voters to agree with the ideas that they've concluded?
If you tend to be a party that is in the centre of politics, then that's where your views are anyway.
Now, in Europe, the Liberal Party is claiming that it's achieved 60 billion of university research funding, 2 billion funding for small businesses, support for UK crime victims abroad, 2 billion, I beg your pardon. How has it done that differently to any of the other parties? They all want those good things.
Well, basically, the Liberal Democrats sit in the third group in the European Parliament, which is Liberal group, which is the Kingmaker group, the swing group. So if we vote with the Liberals, with the Socialists and the Greens, things go that way. If we vote with the centre-right, they go that way. So we are the swing group.
So you have to stop you there, Rebecca.
Bang for your buck with a Lib Dem MEP.
That very nicely got in there at the end. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for on this hot topic. If you're watching before the local and European elections on the 22nd of May, then do remember to vote, but please also remember only one vote each. Goodbye.